Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Gingersnap cookies. That's right, appearances to the contrary, I'm not a big cookie guy. I don't really eat a lot of cookies, nor do I bake a lot of cookies. But with the holidays rapidly approaching, I thought I'd show you a cookie recipe I do like making and eating, which would be this incredibly easy and beautiful Gingersnap. And not only are you going to be able to do this recipe with no electric mixer, this formula is going to work whether you like your Gingersnaps crispy or chewy. So let's go ahead and get started with the star of the show, ginger. So what I have here is some candied ginger, also known as crystallized ginger, and we're going to be using some of this in addition to the traditional dried ginger powder. So while technically optional, I really think this makes this recipe very, very special. And what we're going to want to do is chop this up very finely before we add it to our dough. And a great tip for this is to wipe your blade with a little bit of oil before you start chopping. And this goes for chopping any kind of dried fruit. If you rub your knife with a little bit of oil, it won't get all gummed up as you chop. So we're going to go ahead and chop that up pretty fine, as you can see. And that's going to give these cookies a whole other level of ginger goodness, both flavor-wise and texturally. So we'll go ahead and mince up our ginger, and we'll simply set that aside and move on to the dry ingredients, which is going to start with some all-purpose flour, to which we will add some baking soda. And you might be wondering, will baking powder work? No, it won't. You want baking soda. We also want a pinch of salt, as well as, of course, a generous amount of ground ginger, and an equally generous amount of cinnamon. We're also going to do a little touch of ground clove, and then a couple optional ingredients. Because I do like my Gingersnap spicy, I'm going to toss in a pinch of freshly ground black pepper, and yes, we're going to add some cayenne. Just a little pinch, or a giant pinch. And then we'll go ahead and grab a whisk and give this a mixing, as usual, to make sure all those dry ingredients are thoroughly combined. And we will set that aside and move on to the wet ingredients. And by wet, I mean mostly buttery. So we're going to start with a stick and a half of unsalted room temperature butter. And I know room temp can vary greatly, so what we're looking for is butter that's not too firm and cold. All right, we don't want it melting, but we do want it smearable. Because what we're going to do is we're going to dump in some white sugar, and using the back of our spatula, we're going to cream all that together. And in virtually every cookie recipe known to man, they have you doing this with an electric mixer, which does work great if you have one and really feel like cleaning it. But I don't. So I'm just going to use my spatula, and after a couple minutes of smearing and stirring, you should end up with something that looks like this. And then once our butter and sugar have been successfully creamed together, we will go ahead and add in our minced up candied ginger, as well as some molasses, which is impossible to add quickly. So I always have to basically talk about nothing for a few seconds while it finishes dripping in. Then we're also going to want to do just a little touch of vanilla extract, of course pure and real, as well as one large beaten egg. And then what we need to do is go ahead and emulsify this all together before we add our dry ingredients. And even though I'm very experienced with this, and I do know better, I tried to accomplish this with the spatula because it was already dirty and in the bowl. So I began to spatulate this under the delusion that if I stirred long enough and hard enough, everything would come together and emulsify beautifully. Except right about here I realized that's not going to happen. And I thought to myself, what the heck are you doing? Switch to a whisk and do this right. And having the right tool makes all the difference. Because after just a few seconds of vigorous whisking, this came together perfectly. And yes, I will admit if you use an electric mixer, this does work faster and easier. But assuming you're smart enough to use the whisk, like I eventually did, this will come out exactly the same as if you'd used a mixer. Okay? And then once our wet ingredients are set, the last step is to add our dry ingredients to that bowl and simply mix this with a spatula until the flour just disappears. And while this is not difficult, you want to start out slow. Otherwise, you might have flour flying out of the bowl. And this really is not that temperamental of a dough, so don't worry too much about overmixing. But as I've said many times before, why would you want to mix if you don't have to? So all we're going to do here is mix that with the spatula until the flour disappears, and your mixture looks like this. At which point we're going to stop and not make cookies. Because what we need to do before we form our cookies is wrap this up and chill it in the fridge for about an hour or until it's firm. So that's what you see me doing here. I'm going to wrap it up, I'm going to pop it in the fridge for about an hour, and as you'll see, that dough will have firmed up very nicely. So once our dough is chilled, we're going to go ahead and portion it up. And for that, I like to use this little sorbet scoop, which gives me exactly 1.5 teaspoons. And of course, you could just use a teaspoon to do this. But by using the scoop, you are going to get more uniform sizes. And then once we've scooped our dough, what we want to do is toss it into some sugar and roll it into a nice smooth ball before placing it on a parchment paper-lined baking sheet. But wait, there's more. We're going to take something flat, I just use a ramekin, and we're going to flatten that out. And once that's been accomplished, we'll sprinkle that with a little more sugar, and that's it. So we'll continue on scooping our dough, tossing it in sugar, and rolling it into a nice smooth ball. And then, like I said, we'll place it down on parchment paper, although a Silpat will work here. And by the way, if you use the classic 3-2-3-2-3 positioning system, you'll get what became known as the baker's dozen, which is going to give me 13 perfectly spaced cookies. And once that dough's been panned up, we are ready to head over to the oven, where we are going to bake these at 350 degrees for between 10 and 15 minutes, depending on how crispy you want them. So this pan here I cook for the full 15 minutes, after which they're going to look like this, beautifully, beautifully browned. And since this batch is the crispy batch, we can let those cool right on the pan. And don't worry if a couple are touching. Once these cool down a little bit, you can just snap them apart. And if you do cook them about 14 to 15 minutes, you're going to end up with the classic crispy ginger snap. Or, as I did with this half dozen, you could just cook them 10 or 11 minutes, and you're going to get something that comes out a little bit more on the chewy side. Which, by the way, if you want them to stay that way, you want to get them off that hot pan. So I'm going to slide those off. And as you can see, when you go to snap these, they don't snap. They just sort of bend apart. And while they still might be a little crispy around the edge, that center still should retain a little bit of chewiness. So I'm going to go into detail on the blog post about times and textures. But bottom line, you're going to have to decide. You guys are the Wookiees of your cookies. And speaking of Wookiee, let me go ahead and Chewbacca another one of these so I can brag a little bit more about the taste, which is incredible. These have what I consider the classic Gingersnap flavor, which is predominantly ginger and cinnamon. But because we added that black pepper and cayenne, these have a gorgeous extra spicy finish that I think you're going to find incredibly, incredibly addictive. I mean, if you can somehow eat less than 8 or 9 of these, I'm going to be very impressed. They are just that good. And one thing I find kind of interesting, the stack on the left only cooked 10 or 11 minutes, and this stack on the right cooked for almost 15, and yet they look virtually identical. So really the only difference will be the texture. And which do I prefer? Probably the crispy one. I mean, these are, after all, called Gingersnaps, not ginger silently bend-aparts. But either way, you're talking about an amazing cookie experience. So I really do hope you give these a try soon. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.